Okay, hey, welcome everybody. Check it out, the theme music. We're still adjusting to this level of professionalism with theme music.
Yeah. It's a different guy in the background.
That's true. That's true.
The man behind the tech is Stan today.
That's right. In fact, we should probably reveal that to the people. Normally it's Kevin. He got the big reveal last time. Now it's Stan, and he would be revealing, a nice shot of himself right now, but there he is.
There we go.
Hey, Stan. You guys know and love him, or at least know him
for sure.
Most of you at least know him. Man, people on the chat are already super excited to have our guest, Sean McDowell, today. We've got a bunch of people who are already giving feedback from the message on Sunday. We're super thrilled. We're going to bring him on in just a second. I have to say, I'm already stumbling over my words because Kevin stocked a little mini fridge with Red Bulls in here. This is a true story.
Yeah, I just slammed one right before.
Did you really?
Yeah.
I've had multiple cups of coffee. I didn't need more energy, but I came in here and I saw that they were there, and I was like,
"It's the new technology. It's the peach flavored Red Bull.
Peach nectarine.
Peach nectarine.
Come on, man.
It's really good.
Two of the greatest stone fruits on earth. But you guys are not here to hear me and Isaac talk about the greatest stone fruits on earth. We're really thrilled to bring on our guest. Many of you saw his presentation on Sunday. Sean McDowell, he's an author, apologetics professor, a renowned speaker. He's really particularly focused on young people, young generations, teaching in apologetics that are oriented in that direction. That was the focus of his message on Sunday, understanding the next generation of young adults, Gen Z. And so we are thrilled to have him here to answer your questions. Ladies and gentlemen, wherever you are, a round of silent applause. Sean McDowell. Hey, Sean, welcome.
What's up, guys? Thanks. It's great to be here. Been a fan of what you're doing at your church for a long time, so honored to be a small part of it.
Awesome. Thank you so much for being here. It's been such a treat to have our guest apologist also join us on Thursdays, and we know people have loved the opportunity. Just to read you a couple of the things people have already said in the chat. No questions yet, but just people giving great feedback. Matt Morrow has said that he loves your idea of having his teenage daughter watch some PragerU videos. We had Jill Dowler say that her greatest takeaway was understanding that Gen Z relates more easily to digital and less in person, which we have some questions about later. And then Dina Bless said that her best takeaway, and I agree with her, is that it's better to understand than to be understood. And how we think about this generation shapes how we relate to them, which really kind of is key to what your message was. And this, it's actually a great segue into the first thing I wanted to talk to you about, because one of the things I love about the way you deal with young generations is you have a positive approach. And typically, both younger generations relating to the older and older generations relating to the younger will really focus on the negative, and they'll kind of look down upon the differences between each other. And you have really put a big emphasis on a positive understanding of what makes them different, what are some strengths, what are some weaknesses, but it's not just about, let me tell you what's wrong with these kids today. So was there something about a moment or a realization that you had that led you, A, to put so much time into understanding younger generations, and B, that specifically brought you to that kind of positive approach?
Well, let me start with B. I think the main reason I'm positive is, number one, it's biblical. I mean, you just look in Scripture, and children are a blessing from the Lord. They're the greatest gift that we have to influence the next generation. I mean, Psalms 127:4 talks about how arrows in the hand of a warrior soar the children of one's youth. So if we just look scripturally at children, they're a blessing. And that's a clash with culture, because culture so often breaks us down into Gen Z, Gen X, boomers, and although there's generational truths that can create division, the Bible doesn't see it that way. So I think one is just studying Scripture and seeing how the Bible values kids and children in the next generation. I think the second thing would really just be the influence of my father. I mean, he is an eternal optimist. He has been studying young people. God, he turned 81 a few weeks ago, and he's still kind of a youth worker.
Yeah.
And he's just always told me it's a blessing and it's a privilege. It's an honor to work with youth. And that energy and passion has just rubbed off on me. And third, it works. I mean, it doesn't work to be negative
right.
and critical. I don't want anyone to be negative and critical about me for whatever reason. And sometimes I certainly deserve it. So I can imagine young people don't want to be viewed that way either.
Yeah, that's great. And did you just say your dad has just turned 81?
He is 81
That
years
is
old.
unbelievable. He's been to our church several times. Josh McDowell, of course, one of the most famous apologists on the planet. And he's not just a youth worker still. He's youthful still, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, very much so.
One of the most energetic, exciting, positive people we've ever had speak here. So that's unbelievable. Maybe you could talk a little bit about that too, not to go to back it up, but can you share just a little bit about your path kind of towards becoming an apologist and public speaker and author, and maybe, you know, along with the unique experience of growing up with your dad being so incredibly famous in that space?
Yeah, I'd be happy to talk about it. One of the, you know, it's like when people ask me, why am I an apologist? And I think there's a few components. And number one is having parents, a mom and a dad who lived it, who practiced it, who loved it. I mean, it was just the air my parents breathed over the dinner table, driving in the car. He loved this and it bubbled over. You know, I think scripturally speaking, you know, when you look in the Shema, it talks about love Lord God, your heart, soul, mind, and strength. Pass these things on to your kids. Well, why is it so important that we love God? Because what we're passionate about, our kids will tend to be passionate about. And that's why it's worth asking ourselves, what do we get excited about? And I couldn't help but see parents that love this stuff, see the influence that my father made. And it was just, you know, infecting to me in one sense. The other was my own questions, my own doubts. I went through a period at 19 years old, this is mid-90s, when we first really got email addresses and you couldn't Google yet, but you could search blogs and content online. And I came across all this content challenging my dad's material, and I had never heard it before. Some of the atheist secular web began taking evidence that demands verdict, chapter by chapter, and trying to dissect it.
Wow.
And as a 19-year-old, that really unsettled me. And to make a long story short, I had a conversation with my dad. He showed love to me. He showed care for me. And just, I started to realize I've got to know for myself if I think this is true. And so, given this example of my parents, asking myself what I wanted to do in life, knowing I wanted to work with young people, seeing that they are having real questions, I got to have answers to these questions if I'm going to make a real difference in the life of a young person. So I think it was just my own experience, my love for young people, the example of my father that kind of came together, and it just made sense. And I guess the last piece is just the way I'm wired. I'm wired philosophical. I like to ask questions. I love to learn. That's why I'm a professor, because God wired me this way.
Right. Well, you know, I hope nobody who's a parent missed that, because you said it like it's a normal thing, but the fact that it was your father's your parents' positive, joyful example that was so shaping for you is huge. Because I think a lot of the time, you know, I'm a dad, Isaac's a dad, and you can easily worry about, you know, I got to teach the right things and I got to make sure they believe all the right stuff. And obviously I'm not minimizing that, but this kind of idea that things are caught more than taught, and that your parents had joy and love and positivity, and they made Christianity look like something that you wanted to be a part of. That's very inspiring for me as a parent. So that's great to hear that. Now, one thing,
you know, and I would say,
oh yeah, go ahead.
Just if I can jump in real fast, it was caught, but my parents are also very intentional about teaching me truth as well. I think it's both. We got to give an example, but it never felt to me like, oh, this is his job, let's have our devotional. It was like, my dad was asking questions. What do you think about this? And I studied that, and let's talk. And it just made it engaging like that. So I think it's both.
Yeah, that's huge. What a great legacy. Now, you mentioned, this is kind of changing gears, but you mentioned that Gen Z has until now, I thought this was really interesting, lacked a kind of unifying event or cultural phenomenon that up until now, you know, there's no kind of thing in the collective unconscious of Gen Z. And just for anybody who's watching who's not familiar, we should say Gen Z is everywhere. You know, there's different breakdowns, but it's anywhere from about 95 to 2000 all the way up till 2000. 2010-ish. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, demographers always differ, but essentially you're looking at upper elementary kids through college, and some of the first Gen Zers are into the workplace. And even the difference between a 25-year-old and an 8-year-old in the same generation is just massive. So these studies only take us so far, but you're absolutely right. When I first started researching Gen Z, really the first research came out early 2013, but 2015, 2017, 2018, 2019, into 2020, there was a lot of talk about how there were no longer defining experiences that could capture a generation. It's too fragmented. Well, that was long before COVID.
Right.
And that was long before, I would argue, even some of this Black Lives Matters protests. Wherever you stand on the side of it is not my point. That is defining how this generation is seeing the world. And I would also argue the smartphone being digital natives, you put those things together, and those are really some of the defining experiences for youth.
Yeah. Now, I'm sure you already have, but could you speculate for us a little bit on what impact COVID, lockdown, mask wearing, all of this, it's very, very unique time in our history where anytime you go outside, you're wearing a mask, you're having to stay far away from people. There's all these rules, much more, there's the fear. Can you speculate a little bit on what, as this generation ages and becomes parents, what do you see as some of the potential outcomes of that on this generation?
And that is a great question. And I've thought about that, and I still don't know, because in some ways, kids are impervious to this, in the sense that my son made a TikTok video recently with all his buddies, crammed in the bathroom doing this funny skit about girls. Like, it was totally a funny skit, but I'm like, buddy, you cannot be in a bathroom with 15 guys that close.
Yeah.
Like,
you shouldn't do that when there's not a pandemic.
I mean, right? Like, it was a funny, harmless skit. Like, it was great fun. But still, some of these realities don't sink in, because youth, number one, this virus doesn't affect them the way it does other people. And they're just youth. They all think they're going to live forever. But on the flip side, one of the things about this generation is so many people talked about older millennials and Gen Zers as being like snowflakes, and everybody's fragile with them. Well, this is kind of shaking things up a little bit. That we realize we can't control life as much as we thought. And on one level, we need relationships. I mean, this is a digital generation. Even my daughter, who's 13, like, she wants to be on her smartphone, but she wants to get together so deeply with her friends that I do think there's a sense that smartphones help with relationships. But we lived through COVID. We were there, I can see this generation saying, in 5, 10, 20 years. And you know what? Digital technology can't take you all the way. You need to have relationships and people that you can touch and see and be present with. I think that's a reality that they're going to take with them. The third thing is, in my talk, I talked a lot about truth, and how for this generation, truth is internal, it's in the individual, it's subjective. Well, COVID comes around and says, no, actually the facts matter, how it spreads. The facts matter, whether you wear a mask or not. Right. Now, they've been privy to all these political ways that affects truth. And sometimes it's hard to know truth. But in some ways, I did a blog a few weeks ago, and I said, COVID makes it very clear that truth actually matters, and we better conform our lives to reality. So I could see that playing itself out a little bit with this generation as well. I also think it'll affect them economically. There's a lot in this generation that have seen their parents really suffer, and it'll affect them the way, say, the 2008 crash did, the way younger millennials will handle their money compared to older millennials. So those are 2 or 3 ways that I'm speculating.
Yeah, that's a great point. And that last one, especially when there's a generation that already, a lot of the studies, as you mentioned, are showing that there's much more of a emphasis on safety and security already than with my generation, millennials. Seeing some of these, financial outcomes that are still yet to pass probably could definitely have an impact. Now, you mentioned the almost these kids who've grown up digital natives, maybe seeing some of the inadequacies of that because of COVID. I think that's really interesting. And we had our friend Jay Kim, who wrote Analog Church, on a few weeks ago, and asked him this, but I'm curious about your take as well. What advice would you give, especially in a world where if your kids are in school, unless they're homeschooled, they're doing school online probably in this state also. What advice would you give, number one, parents of younger Gen Z kids, and then also Gen Z folks themselves to have a healthier relationship with technology, especially in light of all of the extra time that has to be spent on it right now?
This is a great question. I had with my son, who's 16. He has a smartphone. My 13-year-old daughter does not. We were pretty dialed in on this with boundaries. And then when COVID hit, man, it went out the window because of homework, because of friends. And like my wife and I have been having conversations because our kids go back to school next week. Like, okay, we need to revisit this and be consistent and ask ourselves, what are those boundaries and how do we hold our kids to them? So that's my biggest suggestion, is just to have realistic, fair boundaries with technology that are reasonable, and do your best to stick to them. And if they don't work, adjust. But, simple things like we don't have phones out at meal times.
Right.
When we're traveling. At night, we collect the phones. Like we create tech-free space and tech-free time. That's the principle. The other thing I'd say to parents is I would say resist giving your kid a phone as long as you need to.
Yeah, that's great advice.
My son didn't get a phone until he was 14 and a half. And in case somebody's saying, oh my goodness, he won't learn technology. Well, he already has 50,000 followers on TikTok and has built a shoe reselling business and is just killing it, to be honest. He did fine with that.
Yeah.
So
yeah, no one's going to get me with that because I didn't get a phone until I was 17, and I'm doing just fine.
There you go. Well, that last part is debatable, but I'm just kidding.
Very debatable.
Couldn't resist.
Yeah,
Here's
I
the
asked
principle, Sam, of how I look at it is my parents didn't give me a car, not just when I was 16, they didn't let me drive, but when they felt I could be responsible behind the wheel. And so my parents never said, when you're 16, you get a car. My dad kind of held it over us a little bit like, hey, when you're 16, that's necessary enough. But if we don't feel like you're respecting us and have boundaries, can handle this, you're not going to get a car. Well, the same with a phone. You don't just give a kid a phone when they turn 13. We made our son do certain things, at least in school, not totally unrealistic, but hey, we know you can get these grades, put in some work in school. Respect to us, character. There were certain things he had to do, so he didn't get a phone until he was 14 and a half. That would be my suggestion for parents when it comes to phones. Have boundaries and resist giving it to them as long as you can. And there's reasons why people like Steve Jobs and Bill Gates actually say don't give kids phone until, 14, 15, or even 16 years old.
Yeah, that's how you know, man, when Steve Jobs is just like, oh no, man, I'm giving my kids one of these phones. No way. But you should buy one,
right?
Yeah.
But one of the books and you've probably read it too, Sean, but just for real practical tips on this stuff is Andy Crouch's Tech-Wise Family.
Yeah.
Just some real practical things. And one of the things I'm hoping that was just mentioned coming out of this is that maybe COVID forces young people to be like, this is lame. Like, look at it. We're all miserable. And a year from now, the research will clearly demonstrate that living in the digital sphere only makes us miserable as human beings. And the evidence is already coming out to say that. And so my hope is it's one of those things that's like, okay, it was meant for evil, but God turned it for good, is that just culturally we would have an awakening that we've become and are becoming slaves to these digital devices, and look what it makes us. It's like this subhuman digital experience that leaves us just devastated. So my hope and prayer is that we'll see the cool thing to do will be to do things in person, and then likewise generationally, just that possibly technology isn't as cool. So like I'm the oldest millennial you can get, so new technology is like
exciting.
Super cool. It's like, oh, so it's really easy to impress me with the cheap tech gimmick. But my hope and prayer is that like younger generations go, meh.
Yeah. Maybe the return of the flip phone for Gen Z would be amazing.
Did you have, Sean, one of those phones that all it had was like a Nokia and only game it had was Snake? Did you ever have one of those?
Bro, I am a middle-aged Gen Xer. I go way back when the first Pong video games came out.
Yeah. The
So I'm really
2600.
dating myself here. But Isaac, I do want to say something that you mentioned I think is really important. I was reading the Common Sense Media report that just came out within the past month, and they said there should be a shift about how we think about technology. Going into COVID, a lot of parents, myself included, was like, how much time do people have on technology? It was purely quantity. And they said, we live in a world now where technology is embedded more than it was before. Look, we're doing this YouTube live conversation that was not being done before. The question is not just time, but how are we using technology within our relationships? And I think time is a factor, but also the way we use it is really, real important, because we're not going back to a pre-YouTube, Facebook, TikTok era. It's here. But how do we use these well and embed them into our existing relationships in a healthy fashion, I think is really the important question.
Yeah, and that goes even for things that, are now old technology. Like one of the things, again, that Andy Crouch talks about in TechWise Family is, hey, when you watch TV together, watch a movie together and then talk about it. So it's not just on in the background.
When you bring out the light bright.
When you bring
do
out
it as a family.
Gather around the light bright.
Gather around the light bright.
Yeah, the light bright chapter was my favorite one in TechWise Family, for sure. Hey, let's get into some of the questions that came in over email, because there's some great ones. Ellen Waddell asked, are there indications of what the identifying characteristics of the generation following Gen Z are projected to be? This is, I've heard it called Generation Alpha, I think, or Generation A.
You know what? I have just started to see the research coming out of this, and we can only speculate for a few reasons. Number one, these are all kids 10 and under, so the amount of studies on them and their self-awareness are pretty minimal anyways. And also, trends are changing so quickly. What we suspect now in 6 months, 2, 3 years could change everything. So I would just say a couple things about this generation. Number one is they will be the first generation that is majority non-white. So there's been a lot of talk about diversity. They will truly be a generation raised where there is no single majority race. And that is novel and significant, that will probably shape this generation pretty radically. And then the other component, now they're being raised by people so savvy with technology, a generation removed from digital natives. We are getting further and further from generations that have a memory before some of this technology. I think that's going to pretty profoundly shape them as well.
So you can't trick mom and dad anymore.
Right.
Like back in the day, you just say, Mom, the computer it doesn't work like that, or whatever. And you're talking with your friends or whatever like that, and they don't even know how to turn it on.
Yeah, it's going to be dads who can beat their kids at Fortnite. That's what it's going to be. Or whatever the new Fortnite is.
That's actually one of my goals, actually, with my children, is that I could always whoop them in Fortnite. Son, just know your place in this household, man.
Yeah, you talk back to me, I'll make you PvP me in front of your friends.
Yep.
That's what the future is. Yeah, that's a great answer. And that is incredibly interesting. It's almost like, the generation that doesn't remember, like we were just joking about, that remembers a time without cell phones, or remembers a time without cars being so ubiquitous. It's hard to imagine what it will be like to have such a universal experience of connectivity. Great answer to a great question. Now, Matt White asks, and I love this question because I'm personally curious as well. In the digital age, where and how would you draw the line between being a helicopter parent and allowing your kids to fail on the internet? He goes on to say, there's no way to meet the friends or followers they have on social media. I do think it's all right to invade their privacy in regards to checking phone calls, texts, website history, etc. However, with the ability to delete conversations and incognito options, what should I, as a parent, do?
Well, I don't know anything else about you, Matt, but I can tell you what I, as a parent, do is I listen to my wife. I'm dead serious. We have a healthy tension where I'm more like, let him fail. He's got to grow up. Fine. Like, maybe it's just a guy thing. And my wife is much more sensitive and attentive. And I think both of those are necessary. There are times where it's more like, let's back off and let him fail with his grades. And there's other times my wife is right where she's like, no, we got to step in and be more involved in this one. So it's a tension and it's a dance. And I can't tell you here's exactly how you fix it. But the other thing it's helped us is knowing my kids and having conversations about this. So I've had a lot of conversations with my kids about things like online, like pornography. I mean, my son, who's 16, we have a ton of conversations with him and his friends and issues like bullying online. I mean, these are regular conversations that we're having. And between the two of us, if we sense like he's not getting things and he's not being respectful and he's not ready for this, then we pull back and bring in more boundaries. But when he shows us he can be responsible, then we give him more leeway. That's the principle we try to operate through. So there's sometimes I've made mistakes like, all right, buddy, I let you fail and I should have been there more.
Yeah.
There's other times I'm like, you know what, I got to back off more. And I don't know how to fix it more than that, other than be attentive to it, ask myself, am I being too involved? Get my son's feedback, look at it with my wife, talk to other parents. So bottom line, this question, I'm in the same boat as you are, Matt. I am trying to make these decisions, and it's not easy.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's, again, with, technology being something that your 16-year-old probably knows things about the apps he uses that you don't know, right? And that will probably continue to become more and more the case. And so I think, but what you said there about kind of cultivating an environment where you're talking about this stuff regularly, it's not taboo, is a huge, huge point. So thank you for that input. And yeah, Matt, we'll continue to wrestle together. And we have an anonymous question that came in that's kind of coming from the opposite direction of your message, which I thought was really interesting. This questioner wants to know, do you have any advice for people, young people, who want to help draw their parents closer to Jesus? So this is somebody who is, a younger millennial, but then there's, of course, Gen Z kids who are more committed to Christianity than their parents are. What would you say are some ways to kind of move the other direction generationally?
First off, I love that question. I wish more kids were saying, how do I draw my parents more towards Jesus? Now, it could be that they're Christians and aren't loving the Lord as much as you want them to, or it could be that they're not Christians at all.
Right.
I had a student in the past who was Christian and his parents were non-Messianic Jews. And he was sneaking out of the house to go to youth group. And I said to him, I was like, buddy, I love that you are sneaking out of your house, not to go to party, not to drink, because you want to go to church. But you also have to honor and respect your parents. That comes first. If they find out, oh, my son is a Christian, and that means disrespecting me, that's going to reflect on their view of the faith. So the first thing I would say to this young person, especially while you're in the home, is model what it means to be a believer to your parents. Resist the urge to be judgmental towards them. That can happen in youth of somebody who's first a Christian, who's excited about their faith, to be judgmental towards their parents and maybe not know a lot of the story and history of what they've been through. So the biggest thing is to model that Christian faith, to show love for your parents. And if you have an opportunity, ask them about their spiritual journey, not judgmentally, not shooting them down. Ask them a lot of questions about their life, what they've experienced, what they've been through, how they've come to their spiritual beliefs. And just asking a lot of those questions might give you a lot more compassion towards them and also an understanding of where their real issues are. So you can lovingly maybe be an influence for them in that specific area.
Yeah, that's great. And what would you say for somebody where it's more of a situation where their parents are nominal or maybe, lukewarm in the kid's estimation, for kind of trying to encourage spiritual growth for someone who is a Christian?
Well, what I would say, since I don't know this family and this circumstance, is I would talk to somebody you respect, who knows you and your parents, and run it off them. Because if you're 14, 15, 16 years old, you probably have some blind spots about life. That's the nature of the game. And in your eagerness, you want to make sure you see things closely to what they actually are. So whether it's a pastor, a teacher, a coach, somebody that you respect and know that feels like they can hear you out, go to that person and talk it through with them. I think that person is going to be able to give you the best advice to how to apply that to your particular circumstance.
Yeah, that's great wisdom, because all of those situations are so different. Nuances are so different. And like you said, you have to start with the humility of going, you might not be even seeing the situation accurately. So that's great input. We had a question that came in the chat that I want to jump to, because we're sort of moving off this topic, but before we do, I want to get here. Suzanne Lopez, the wonderful Suzanne Lopez, asks, how does all of this virtual learning positively or negatively affect the kids? Now, I know, again, we're speculating because this is brand new, but what are your thoughts on that?
Well, it depends on how much virtual learning you get. It depends on the kind of virtual learning that they're getting and the other kind of activities they're having outside of learning. So there's a lot of factors here. I guess one thing I would say is everybody knows this is not ideal, and we need to have it end as soon as we can. So some kids, for example, that don't have the resources and the money and the training at home and the technology are really genuinely falling behind those who have the technology and people to train with them. And that's heartbreaking.
Yeah.
Because we have Wi-Fi in our home. I have a computer. I was actually able in the spring for 3 months to homeschool my son, who's 7 at the time, he's 8 now, for about 2 hours a day. That's the only time I had, but it was kind of a cool season. Well, there's a lot of people that didn't have the technology, did not have the time because of what they do, and their kids fell behind because of that season. So there's an awful lot of kids in that category. Second, there's also a lot of kids who are home right now, and school was the respite for them from the conflict and pain and hurt at home. And there's a lot of students I've worked with and talked with that there's family, just the tension that's at home, some abuse that can be at home, even if it's not physical, it's emotional. And they feel suffocated because they can't get out and be with people. So as a whole, I mean, there's no coincidence that we're seeing an increase in loneliness and depression and anxiety across all generations, including young people, even thoughts of suicide, sadly. I just had a friend who I never would have expected, a peer of mine, take his own life not long ago. And it just reminded me that it can be anybody, and even a lot of our kids. So we have to be more attentive than ever to their hurts and make sure we're relationally connecting with them.
Yeah, no, that is great input. And I love your focus on some of the more disadvantaged children and the impact this is having on them. Because for some reason, it doesn't seem to be, we've talked about it before, but it doesn't seem to be a major part of the discourse or the decision-making. But, I just saw a story today there was this picture of kids huddled around outside of a Taco Bell because there's free Wi-Fi there. And you just imagine, this is the disadvantage and the kind of backwards progress academically that can happen disproportionately to kids in that situation is unbelievable. Yeah,
the kids who were already falling between the cracks are now exponentially more likely to do that. Yeah. You're going to go Wi-Fi, or you could try to Zoom with your class as you're a 7-year-old.
Yeah.
And then maybe sometimes it's your 3rd grade teacher that's the only one that gives you encouraging words and tells you can do it, I believe in you.
Yeah.
And now that's just gone. It's just ripped out. So the effects of this, I mean, we have no clue, in my opinion.
Idea. Yeah, and this is probably a good call for Christians to be attentive to your neighbors, to your friends, and try to be maybe alert to if you're catching, a wind of maybe these kids need some help. Maybe this family needs some help right now. Whether it could be something as simple as, hey, they need help getting Wi-Fi to their house. They need a device with a camera on it. And so you just never know when, and obviously it takes a lot of tact and care to not overstep boundaries, but to be aware there could be huge opportunities to really change someone's life right now just by noticing someone.
Yeah.
But yeah, really heartbreaking stuff for sure. Now, another question that came in from a Gen Z dude, Michael Perez, He is asking, and this is kind of a long question, but it's a really good question, so I'm going to read the whole thing. He says, I had a question regarding one of the conversation starters from the last sermon. By not valuing diversity, a person of the latest generation may think you are... Oh, we got some sound coming. Is that on your end, Sean, or is that...
You got a vacuum? You got the Roomba in the background? Little vacuum in the background, Sean?
I kicked on a little fan. That was louder than I realized?
Oh, it was on our end.
Loud.
It looked like maybe like a transformer was starting a battle in the background.
Is it good now? I turned it down, or should I turn it off?
That's good now. Yeah, totally. I was waiting for someone with a vacuum to walk by in the background.
I mean, you just don't know. It's 2020, man. The robots might attack. Skynet might become self-aware at any moment.
At any moment. Yeah.
So...
Yeah. Okay. We've talked enough about 2020. I was going to make another rundown of all the things that have happened this year and say, giant robots would not be a surprise at this point.
Would not be surprising.
So sorry about that. But hopefully you got enough fan to keep you cool. Michael Perez asks, I had a question regarding one of the conversation starters from the last sermon. By not valuing, he's quoting the question now, by not valuing diversity, a person of the latest generation may think you are racist. Just by not valuing diversity. Then he says, in talking with my father, I am mid-20s and he's a baby boomer, I discovered we must actually define what racism is before we can apply this label. But what happens when two generations have different definitions of the same word? And then he adds the caveat, disclaimer, while we disagree, I don't categorize my father as a racist. He's real nice. So just in case his dad's watching. But that's a great question. Talking about definitions being complete, you using the same word, but you and a member of a different generation means something completely different.
Here's what I would say. First thing I would say is to the Gen Zer, spend a ton of time asking your dad, your grandparents, older people about their experience with race. And listen, it's easy to look at older generations and think, you know what? They didn't get it. We're more enlightened. And sure, we've made some progress, but older generations have a ton to offer, and I think we should approach with humility. So I've spent a ton of time recently asking my parents questions I had never asked them before. Asking my dad, what was it like growing up in Michigan with race? Completely different than my mom when she lived in Georgia in the 50s with race. And, you know, what was it like? Did you ever feel biased because of your race? What did you see? I mean, I've spent hours asking them. And it's been very eye-opening and learning for me to see where that generation is coming from. So that's the first thing. Second, lead with grace towards earlier generations. We have what's called cancel culture right now. If you've ever said anything 8 years ago, we're going to destroy your life and cancel you. Well, the problem with cancel culture is there's just no grace. There's no forgiveness. There's no room for somebody to learn and grow. And that's what's being pushed within this generation, and that we need to resist it. The third thing I would do is I would just ask, I'd say, okay, Dad, how do you define race? And listen, and understand, or racism, and listen, and say, you know, the message we're getting today is a little bit different. Here is what it is. What do you think about this definition? And try to have a conversation about it. I realize these are just such explosive conversations because they're emotion filled, but do your best to, number one, listen. Number two, extend grace. And you know what? The way I think about it is maybe someday you're going to be having a conversation with your kids, and it's Gen Alpha, Gen whatever, and they're going to look at your generation and think, you know what? They weren't enlightened. They didn't get it. Now we understand race and are operating on a different definition. My guess is you would say, you know what? As I look back on my life, maybe I had some faults, but I hope they'll extend grace to me. Thinking about it that way can transform the way you approach your dad. And hopefully, if you listen and you ask questions, you say, hey, Dad, can I share with you what it's like for me and where I'm coming from and how I feel like there's a different definition of race going on? I think the vast majority of people would be willing to have that conversation. Now, if he says, no, I'm closed-minded, and it doesn't sound like he is because he described him as nice, then that's a different conversation. But lead with charity, lead with grace, lead with understanding. And at the end of the conversation, the goal is not necessarily to change your dad. I think the goal is to say, Dad, I think I understand where you're coming from. Do you understand where I'm coming from? And that's a win in a conversation. That would be my goal and my approach.
Yeah, that's great. And what a difference that is. I think most of us start any kind of conversation that involves conflict without a clear idea of what our goal is. You know what I mean? And when you're talking there and saying, you know, hey, try to understand each other. You want to be understood and you want to understand rather than trying to win an argument that frankly is you know, it just doesn't happen. People don't ever win arguments. You know what I mean? And so I love.
I only want to win.
Isaac only wants to win. And he often does.
That's not true. I am right.
I am
You
right.
are wrong.
This conversation is actually me explaining to you why I'm right, not me convincing you.
Yeah, actually, we brought you on just to get to that point so Sam can work that out with me.
Yeah. Clearly, there's been a misunderstanding. You seem to think. Yeah, but I mean, you know, all joking aside, to come into, I've talked about this before with, you know, in your marriage, you'll be arguing with your wife or your husband and realize, I don't even know what my goal is here.
Yeah.
Like, what am I trying to accomplish? How do I win? Who benefits from that? And so I think we just got a comment. Somebody came in and said, if you ain't first, you're last. So they're agreeing with you, Isaac, on the...
Who is that person, man? They're right.
I don't know. They've got, their name is Color Me Rad.
Second place is still a loser, man.
Yeah, it's true. It's awesome, though, because Suzanne Lopez commented very wise words, but it popped up right under the person who said, if you ain't first, you're last. So
I'm going to take that as an affirmation of winning.
That's great. But yeah, great advice there to lead with a desire to understand and with humility to think that, hey, you know, just because we have different views of this doesn't mean that I'm automatically correct.
And that's a principle that could be used across the board in that tribalism has taken root in our culture. So we have this postmodern tribalism all over the place, and there's tons of different groups and subgroups, and we're often using the same words, but in radically different ways. So oftentimes, not just between a son and a dad, but just you're talking to someone across the political spectrum on a different theological side of the spectrum, and you're just using words differently. So we need to constantly be clarifying, no, this is what I mean by that. And it's okay if you disagree, but I want you to at least disagree with me over the right thing, because I'm not saying this.
Yeah, that's a great point. If you're going to disagree with what I actually think, not a misunderstanding.
Yeah, exactly.
But we're often so quick to try to get our point out that we're not paying attention and listening for where those misunderstandings are happening. So I think that's great advice. And I just think the general advice of, hey, if you've got a parent who will talk to you about this stuff, man, the majority of parents, if you come to them with a desire to learn or to just have a deep conversation, and they're probably just going to be thrilled. And you know, if you have that type of relationship with them. So great advice. Now, you talked quite a bit, this is another anonymous question, about the next generation's kind of post-truth, postmodern epistemology and the fact that it's kind of a post-truth world. And you mentioned that earlier tonight as well. How do you recommend approaching this? Is this something you approach head on? Is it something you approach subversively? But the questioner asks, how do you prove that something is true to someone who denies that the category of true and false even exists?
I love this. I literally love this question. Here's why. So many of the forces in our culture are saying it's a post-truth culture. If you believe it, it's true for you. Feelings over science. But everybody is still made in God's image and lives in God's world. Thus, we intuitively know that truth really does matter. So I'm not trying to convince somebody that truth matters. I'm trying to bring to the surface that they actually know and believe that truth matters, and they just need to come to grips with something they already hold. So I had a student one time when I was speaking, this is a few years ago now, I was speaking on truth, and he came up to me afterwards and he goes, you just spoke for an hour on truth. He said, why is truth important? I said, well, do you want the true answer or the false answer? And he paused and looked at me, he goes, I got it, and literally just walked away. In other words, asking the question, is truth important, already assumes that truth is important. So I think about it like a beach ball. If you push a beach ball underwater, by its very nature, because of gravity in the beach ball, it's going to pop to the surface. And it takes a lot of energy to push it and keep it down. That's what our culture is doing with truth. But in our hearts, we know that truth matters, and we live our lives daily based upon what we think is true. So bottom line is, I want to find some way to illustrate to this person that they know and believe that truth is important. I want to bring that to the surface rather than convince them of something they don't already hold. That's the basic idea of the strategy. And you can do this by asking questions. You can do this by listening. You can do this by illustrations. But that's the strategy where I go with people. And then when they agree and realize, okay, now let's talk about whatever the issue is and how we know it's true. But people in their hearts want truth. I mean, just tell somebody a lie and they'll quickly tell you, wait a minute, that's a lie, as if you should tell them the truth, and truth matters. I'm not suggesting that it's a strategy. I'm just saying we all know that.
Yeah, and so you're talking about not necessarily having a direct argument about epistemology with someone, but instead trying to find examples from their life or your lives that you know they'll agree with that depend upon the category of true and false existing. What are some examples of what that might be?
Well, I don't know that I usually have conversations with people who just in general say, I don't believe in truth.
Right.
But I will have conversations with people that'll say things like, you know, gender is totally a construct and it's a feeling that they have. And that's where I'll bring up illustrations. I'll say, okay, let's take, and this is not a political endorsement or criticism. I'll say, do you recall when Obama came out and he was in favor of same-sex marriage? Yeah, he pushed it, first president to promote it. Okay, if you're in favor of same-sex marriage, then that is the idea that a kid doesn't need a mom and a dad, that two dads and or two moms are equivalent in the family. Gender is irrelevant to the institution of the family. You have to believe if you're in favor of same-sex marriage. Okay. Well, when he had the opportunity to nominate somebody for the Supreme Court, his first two nominees were both women, Kagan and Sotomayor. Why? Well, he said a woman sees things differently and brings a different perspective to the court. Well, wait a minute. You can't say gender is irrelevant in the institution of the family, but all of a sudden now it magically matters when it comes to the court. Well, which is it? So he embraced same-sex marriage probably for reasons he saw equality and fairness. I'm not questioning his motivations, but he later contradicted himself when it came to the Supreme Court and revealed that he actually does believe that there is a truth about gender and it matters. That's the kind of example that I'm looking for to bring to the surface with somebody.
Yeah, and in that case, you could ask which of those two decisions is the right one, right? And sort of
question.
And what's interesting is no matter what you land on that, especially in the last few years, no matter where you land on any of these issues, people are more passionate about what they think is right now. So, I mean, I'm telling you, 5 years ago, it was different. People are extremely passionate about what they feel is right. So wherever you land, I mean, just talk to someone. They're going to argue it, and they're going to be passionate about it.
Life and death.
You can see it right now with all the issues that are going on in our country. There's rage, and there's fury, and there's this going on and that, and it's not because people actually deep down believe truth is relative. It's precisely because they believe these things are so incredibly important that we're going to say something about it. We're going to stand up about it. And so I think now actually it's easier than it was 5 to 10 years ago to talk about that, because it's like people really genuinely feel if this is wrong and I want to say something about it.
Yeah.
That is rooted in something. So it's no longer trying to prove necessarily does objective ethical truth and morality exist. It's what is going to ground that for you.
Yeah,
and as
wow.
a Christian, we have our ground is in the nature of God himself. And so we would say, this is why we believe this and hold this, and this is why we hold on to these. What grounds your passionate kind of fervor regarding issue A, B, or C?
Yeah, and that's, I mean, what an incredible insight, because if you were able, when you're talking to someone you care about, to instead of arguing about the thing, transcend that and talk about the fact that they care so deeply about.
Yeah, it's sort of like there was on something you've been on, Sean, Unbelievable with Justin Briley.
Oh, yeah. Welcome along to Unbelievable.
Yeah. He had Jordan Peterson and Susan
Blackmore.
And yeah, basically there's that point where he just goes, Susan, it's because you're following the logos type of thing. But in a similar sense, you disagreeing with someone and they're feeling passionate about this, and you drop, just as you said, you drop sort of the argument for a second. You say, I see you care about this. It's because you're made in the image of God. You can't escape this. So even though you and I disagree, you have to at least say this matters. And if it matters, what grounds that? It's because you're made in the image of God.
What if you as a Christian were willing to take an L on the debate in order to make that greater point?
I'm not willing to do that.
To be clear, Isaac's not willing to. But if you're not first, you're last. That's the thing. But I mean, that's
your point is true.
I think that's an incredible insight that you could just by, and Sean's example of this, those are both obviously spicy things to bring up in a conversation, right? But to be able to, like you did, Sean, go, I'm not even talking about the yes or no of the issue itself, but why? What's behind that? I think that's really, really powerful, because again, it's people are demonstrating that they do believe something is true and that something is false and something is right and something is wrong. Whether they would, they might pass a lie detector test saying they don't believe in objective truth, but when it comes to, arguing about things they care about, they're going to reveal their cards. Yeah.
And by the way, I think what you said, Isaac, is exactly right. You go back to the 90s and early 2000s, there was a live and let live, to each his own, non-judgmental spirit that kind of pervaded. That's gone. If you're not anti-racist and speak up in a certain way on issues, you're a bigot and you're a racist and you should be canceled. People have no problem making moral condemnations. So that's pretty easy to point out to people, that we know there's such thing as moral standards. Usually when people claim relativism, what they're trying to do is silence your opinion, not really make the point that there's no such thing as moral truth. That's the move that I think most people are making. I think we need to be aware of it when they do that. But second, if somebody doubts truth, say, look, do you think the coronavirus exists? Do you think masks work? Does it matter if we get these answers correct? We know it's a life and death issue. Why? Because truth matters. We got to get our facts right. I think just pointing this out is obvious to people. They know it, even though our culture just spews so many confusions about it.
Everyone just says, what does the science say? What does the science say? And there's all kinds of debate about what the science says, but the Christian needs to understand you're at a unique moment where everyone's saying, what does reality say? What does reality say? We're going to debate on interpretation of said reality, but this is fundamentally different in that it's what is true.
Yeah, the question is what's real. And man, I just, the thing that's hitting me from you guys bringing this up is how often Christians are missing a gigantic opportunity to make an epistemological point because we're arguing. We've stooped to the level of arguing about,
and we want to be right on Facebook rather than or Instagram, whatever it may be. I'm old millennial, so I don't know what the young bucks are on social media.
TikTok, I believe.
Yeah, flip flop or whatever it's called, man. But again, to your point, what if it wasn't about winning this small point when we could actually make grounds on such an important point, like, is truth real and objective?
Yeah, that's great. What a helpful point that you guys made. Okay, you know what? We are almost out of time. I'm going to ask you one more question, Sean. This is sort of like a practical, more pastoral question. You've spent a lot of time, more than most, thinking about Gen Z and doing your best to understand them. If you could tell every member of Gen Z one thing, what would it be? What's your message to Gen Z?
Dang. That's a tough one, man.
And they're all listening to this, so it's
all
real.
of them in the whole world.
Let me speak to Gen Z Christians. Let me say that.
Yeah.
Let me say, we desperately need people in your generation to love God and love other people. I'm older than you. I've been here longer. And one thing I've learned, that what matters when it's all said and done is whether you have lived your life loving God or loving other people. And there's a desperate need in your generation for young people to live the gospel and to stand up and not buy into a lot of the false ideas that are being pressured on you. I see it in my kids. I see the temptation and the pressure to be liked and to live the way of the world. But I'm telling you, Jesus said, seek ye first the kingdom of God, and these things shall be added unto you. My heart cry to young people would be, love God, love other people, and go back to the scriptures and take your ultimate message from what scripture teaches, not your feelings, not your culture, not your friends. When it's all said and done, scripture. And if you do that, God's going to use you to make a difference in your generation. That'd be my message to young people.
Yeah, that is hard to top. Absolutely. And in a world without fixed points, to have something you can be grounded to, I think is a powerful thing. So that's a great word. And I hope everybody listening who's part of that generation hears that. Sean, thank you so much. You've been so generous to South Valley Community Church over the years, and we just appreciate it a ton. Everybody, why don't you let everybody know where they can find you as far as social media, your website? What's the best way to get a hold of you and to get information about your books and speaking?
Sure. So first off, I am a huge fan of SVCC and appreciate you guys keep inviting me back. And I've said this many times, I wish more churches had the same vision for the life of the mind, evangelism, engaging culture, and apologetics. I wish I didn't have to say this, but you are a rare church, and I'm honored to be a small part as I do. I use a ton of social media. I've started a YouTube channel with a lot of good content. I am on TikTok. I'm on Twitter. I'm on Instagram.
He's on TikTok, everybody.
Did your kids have to teach you?
Dude, let me tell you something. My son told me in March, he's like, Dad, you got to get on TikTok. That's where students are. So I got on there.
Man.
And I have 17,000 followers. I've done pretty decent.
Wow. You're a cross-cultural missionary, Sean. That's like going to a foreign country.
I was like talking trash to my son, like, dude, I'm older and I'm killing you on TikTok. And then he just blew up,
man,
which is pretty awesome.
That is cool.
We both are, and it's fun to just do it together and compare videos. And he's got a different lane than me. But bottom line, what ties a lot of it together is my website, seanmcdowell.org, is where I blogs at. We have a podcast at Biola that has great, just apologetic worldview content. So if you visit seanmcdowell.org, you'll see the books, you'll see social media, and all the things that kind of ties it together.
Man, that is great. Everybody check that stuff out. Incredible books and just tons and tons of resources. If you're in Gen Z, follow them on TikTok. I don't have one, so I can't do that, Sean. But I genuinely, all joking aside, I admire that commitment to reach that generation. That's huge. God bless you. Thank you so much for being here with us tonight. And everybody in the chat is saying thank you so much for being here. So thanks. You're a blessing to the church with a capital C.
Well, my pleasure. Blessings to you guys. Thanks for having me on.
Absolutely. Have a great night.
Later, man.
All right, everybody. If only we had the rousing applause button, we could get some giant.
It doesn't work.
I think.
Oh, we erased it.
We erased it when we added our theme song.
We're gonna need some. We gotta get the fake claps back for sure.
We're gonna need some applause for sure. But man, what a great guy. And honestly, like we were joking about it, but the fact that he's on TikTok is how you know he's the real deal. You know what I mean? He's like, he talks about reaching the younger generation, but he's actually where they are. You know what I mean? If there's a place people are hanging out online, it's there. People send me links, my younger siblings will be like, here's a TikTok video. And I'm like, I don't even know what this is.
I don't.
Yep. Nor will I. But man, again, just so awesome to have him. Hey, we are, this is the end of our apologetics series. So he was the last guest we have from our apologetics series, but we're going to be back next week talking about eschatology. And one of the things I want to throw out to all of you guys is this question and answer format has been so helpful and so cool just to get to hear from you about specifically what you want to know. So I would just want to invite you in an ongoing way. My email is always open for Theology Thursday questions. So any question you have specifically about eschatology, the end of the world, the book of Revelation, all that stuff, please send them away. And then also...
Or how about we do it like this? Hit the like button right now if you want us to keep doing Q&A at the end.
Yeah, there you go.
You got to hit the like button. If you don't hit the like button, it's not going to happen.
It's never going to happen. So you got to do it right now. And we can see if you're doing it or not. So we're waiting. And so far, y'all are disappointing us.
Come on. One like, two...
One
You
like,
start to
two
get real
like.
desperate. I was trying to get like 100 likes, and now, hey, can we? How about someone
about
give us
one?
a thumbs down? How about a thumbs down just to let us know you're there?
Robert Bengal says he already hit the like, so it's
Okay,
too late,
good,
but he
good,
would
good,
have.
good.
And so if you have questions about anything that you'd like Isaac and I to address theologically, but we're going to be focusing on eschatology, but we'll take pretty much anything, and if it fits, every once in a while we'll be able to address and answer those. So send them in. Come back here next Thursday at 7:30. We'll be back here again, and thank you guys so much for being here. Why don't you play us out, gentlemen?
While I hit the like button.
Oh, Isaac's going to like it.
We're going to get...